Concept 9.5, the end of the chapter, the last couple of concepts deal with fermentation and anaerobic respiration, which are two variations on the cellular respiration theme that we've been looking at. Most of the creatures we've been talking about are eukaryotic organisms, so that would be like an oak tree or a dog or a human, and they carry out aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen and goes through the three steps we mentioned, the glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain, the oxidative phosphorylation. But there are some variations on that. When you're talking about biology and living things, you're also talking about billions of years of evolution and adaptation. So there's going to be some variety there. There's going to be some different ways that different creatures have of dealing with the same problems and issues. So concept 9.5 mentions fermentation and anaerobic respiration, and it says it enables cells to produce ATP without the use of oxygen. So there are some creatures, particularly microbial creatures and prokaryotic creatures, who live oftentimes in environments that are not rich in oxygen, or they lack oxygen altogether. So most cellular respiration requires O2 to produce ATP. Without that O2, the electron transport chain doesn't work. If you don't have, basically, again, that oxygen molecule at the end of the transport chain, kind of calling to those electrons in a way, or luring those electrons down the chain, well, then the whole system doesn't work. So in that case, what you have is glycolysis, which, remember, doesn't require oxygen. And then you have something else, either fermentation or anaerobic respiration, to produce ATP for those cells. Anaerobic respiration is very similar to the aerobic respiration that we already looked at. The only difference is when you get to the electron transport chain, the final electron acceptor is something other than oxygen. So it has to be something that is fairly electronegative to pull those electrons down that chain. But it's not going to be oxygen. It's going to be something else, oftentimes sulfate. There are other materials that will work as well. But that's really the only difference. So in aerobic respiration, we don't have the oxygen that we need. So we go through the same processes, but in that electron transport chain, the final step doesn't end up with oxygen. It usually ends up with sulfate or some other sort of material that's also electronegative. Fermentation is slightly different. Fermentation doesn't go through all the same three steps. It uses substrate level phosphorylation instead of an electron transport chain. So remember, substrate level phosphorylation is where there's an enzyme and a substrate, and it pulls off a phosphorus group from that substrate and forces it to combine with ADP to make ATP. So that's fermentation. It does not use the electron transport chain. Let's take a closer look at fermentation, because it's the one that's probably the most different than the one we've already looked at. So fermentation is glycolysis, which all of them do glycolysis because that doesn't require oxygen. Plus, it's a reaction that regenerates NAD+. Remember, NAD+ is our electron carrier. When it grabs the electron, the hydrogen atom with its electron, it becomes NADH. So we need to produce NAD+ so that it can carry these electrons, and fermentation does that. Fermentation is glycolysis plus a reaction that regenerates NAD+ so that it can be reused in more glycolysis. There's two common types of fermentation, alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Both of those we can give good examples of, and we'll take a quick look at those. In alcohol fermentation, after glycolysis, we have those pyruvate molecules. In alcohol fermentation, that pyruvate is converted to a type of alcohol called ethanol. It takes a couple of steps to do that, and it releases carbon dioxide gas. Alcohol fermentation is what occurs when your mom or dad, if they ever made homemade rolls or homemade bread and they add yeast, that is going to be alcohol fermentation that the yeast do. The yeast can create their ATP in anaerobic conditions without oxygen, and they use fermentation to do that. So that's used in baking. It's also used in brewing beer and wine making. All of those are fermentation processes. So if you didn't realize this, the yeast, like, you can go to the store and buy these little packages of yeast that your mom or dad might add to dough to make it rise. Those are living organisms. And the reason that bread dough puffs up, it rises. Usually your mom and dad will add the yeast to the dough and then let it sit for a while to rise. Well, the reason that it rises and gets all puffy is because inside these yeast, once they get the materials that they need, they suddenly begin this fermentation process. And a byproduct of that is carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide gas puffs up the bread dough and makes it all nice and puffy. It's why you see all the tiny little holes in your slice of bread. It's caused by bubbles of gas, bubbles of carbon dioxide gas produced by the yeast in fermentation. So here's the process of fermentation. If we don't have oxygen, so the same process as the one we already looked at, we have glycolysis, which creates 2 ATP and the 2 pyruvates. Then if we had oxygen, this process would head off into the mitochondria. If there is no oxygen available, fermentation is a possible process for some creatures. So here we have at the top, this is a fermentation process for producing alcoholic fermentation. The bottom one is lactic acid. We'll look at that one in just a second. If you want to right-click and hit play, you can take a look at this animation. Again, luckily we don't have to know all the exact steps of the fermentation process, but you would need to be aware that it's a process that occurs without oxygen. It's a process that basically takes the pyruvate and allows it to take ADP and NADH and recycle these. So the NADH can be recycled over and over and over again, or the NAD plus becomes NADH and then can be recycled back to the NAD plus again. That allows for phosphorylation, creating some ATP. We combine ADP with a couple of phosphorus groups and we can create some ATP through this process. This releases carbon dioxide and it also creates alcohol, a type of alcohol called ethanol. The other type of fermentation I mentioned was lactic acid fermentation. This is the type of fermentation that occurs inside your muscle cells. If you're working out really hard or you're lifting a lot of weights or you're running, say, a marathon, your muscles are actually working so fast and so hard that they use up their supply of oxygen. You can't breathe fast enough and your blood supply can't carry the oxygen quickly enough to those muscle cells. So to continue working, to continue producing the ATP that they need and to continue doing their job, they'll actually go into a fermentation process. So in lactic acid fermentation, that pyruvate from glycolysis is reduced to NADH, and that forms lactase, which is lactate, which is a end product, and there's no release of carbon dioxide. Lactic acid fermentation is done by some fungus and bacteria making cheese and yogurt. That sour taste of the yogurt or the strong taste of some of the cheeses is caused by various types of acids, including lactic acid. So this is a fermentation process, again, without oxygen that allows for the production of ATP. Like I mentioned, human muscle cells even do this type of fermentation when they are running low on oxygen, when they don't have enough oxygen. This allows them to still generate ATP, but they can continue to do their job even when the oxygen is scarce, when you're not able to take in enough oxygen. It used to be thought that the lactic acid buildup is what caused you to be sore the next day, sore and tired, and when your muscles are aching after you've worked out really hard. We're not really quite sure if that's the case anymore. Some scientists now think that it's actually a buildup of potassium ions that causes that pain and stiffness and soreness. But when I was in school, they always told us it was the lactic acid buildup. But new experiments are kind of showing that that may not exactly be the cause. But that is kind of a byproduct of this lactic acid fermentation, or these sore muscles. Again, we don't have to know all the particular steps, but we're starting with pyruvate, just like we have with all the processes. And then we're going through this cycle where NAD plus can be reconfigured to NADH, and it can go round and round. And we're also producing lactate, and then we're allowing for the production of ATP via the glycolysis here. So you'll notice there's no carbon dioxide given off as a byproduct, and the other byproduct is lactate instead of ethanol. So why don't we do a quick comparison of the three types of respiration, basically, that we're talking about here. We had fermentation. Remember, fermentation occurs without oxygen, and it doesn't use the electron transport chain. And then we had anaerobic, which is without oxygen. It does use the electron transport chain, but it doesn't use oxygen. It uses a different electron acceptor. And then we had regular aerobic respiration, which was the main one that we talked about with the 3 steps. So all of them use glycolysis, which gets you 2 ATP, or nets you 2 ATP. It actually creates 4, but uses 2, so you end up with 2. To oxidize glucose and harvest chemical food energy. So all 3 of these go through glycolysis. In all 3 of them, NAD+ is your oxidizing agent, your electron carrier during glycolysis. They do start to differ from that point. They have different final electron acceptors. In organic molecules such as pyruvate or acetaldehyde in fermentation, oxygen in cellular respiration. So they have different final electron acceptors for the different 3 processes. And cellular respiration produces by far the most ATP, 32 ATP per glucose. Fermentation only produces about 2 ATP per glucose. So again, cellular respiration, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic, produces far more ATP than fermentation. In fermentation, you're really only getting the ATP that you produce in glycolysis, but then you're also allowing for the NADH, NAD+ kind of cycle to keep glycolysis going. So for every molecule of glucose, you get only 2 ATP in fermentation, whereas you get up to 32 ATP in the aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Finally, let's just briefly mention the different types of what are called anaerobes. An anaerobe would be one of these creatures that does this process without oxygen, so either through fermentation or anaerobic respiration. There are basically 2 categories of anaerobes. Anaerobes can be called obligate, which means they either do fermentation or anaerobic respiration, and they cannot survive in oxygen. So these guys, not only can they not use the oxygen to do respiration, but the presence of oxygen actually is a detriment to them. So they have to live in oxygen-free environments. And then there are some others that are called facultative anaerobes. Facultative anaerobes are like yeast, and there's a lot of different kinds of bacteria that are like this that can survive using either system. They can either do fermentation if they have to. They can do fermentation if there's no oxygen present, or they can do some form of cellular respiration if the oxygen is present or if another electron acceptor is present. That would probably make them from an evolutionary standpoint, that would be a great benefit to be a facultative anaerobe, because you could get this ATP process going with oxygen, which would be much more efficient and produce a lot more ATP. But even if there was no oxygen present, you can still survive and create your ATP that you need just in the inefficient fermentation method. So the break point, or the determining point, the fork in the road, is at the pyruvate. So if we look at a chart here, we have a glucose molecule or an organic molecule coming in. They all do glycolysis, but then we get to the pyruvate, which is the broken down glucose molecule. If there's oxygen present, we go ahead and do aerobic cellular respiration into the mitochondria. If we're talking about a eukaryote, acetyl coenzyme A, citric acid cycle, all the way through to the electron transport chain. So in the electron transport chain, then we're ending up with oxygen, or perhaps another electron carrier or in carrier. If we don't have any oxygen present, well, then the choice is made to go to fermentation route, and that's either going to be producing alcohol like ethanol or lactate or other products. We're not going to get as much ATP, but it still allows us to survive in this particular method. As I mentioned at the very first of this course, anything in biology, or almost every piece of information in biology, can be better understood if you understand the evolutionary process that made these creatures possible, or allowed these species to develop over time. So what is the evolutionary significance of glycolysis? Because glycolysis was really the only one that all 3 had in common. Whether it's fermentation or aerobic or anaerobic, they all do glycolysis. Well, it's thought that the ancient prokaryotes, the ancient simple prokaryotic creatures that eventually developed into everything else, they did glycolysis probably long before there was an environment that was heavy in oxygen. When the Earth was very young, say 3.5 billion, 3 billion years ago, the atmosphere was not very rich in oxygen. The oldest prokaryote fossils or fossil evidence dates from about 3.5 billion years ago, and there was very little O2 in the atmosphere at that time. So oxygen in the atmosphere didn't really start to build up and develop till about 2.7 billion years ago. So the first prokaryotes probably only used glycolysis to produce ATP. And that also makes sense when you think about the fact that these are prokaryotes, so they're simple organisms. They don't have all of the organelles yet. They don't have mitochondria and things like that. So again, glycolysis makes more sense from that perspective too. So that means glycolysis is a very ancient process. It was probably the first of these ATP producing processes. And that's why you find it common amongst all the variations. It's kind of like the root of the tree, and then you have branches that kind of come off from that, from that root of glycolysis. You have a fermentation branch, you have an anaerobic branch, and you have an aerobic branch. And then you have the smaller branches of species separating out from there. So let's go ahead and wrap this up with concept 9.6. We want to tie everything together. Again, think big picture. Glycolysis and the citric acid cycle connect to many other metabolic pathways. So none of these pathways that we're looking at are standalone pathways or standalone processes. They all integrate with all the other processes that the cell has to do to stay alive. And it says glycolysis and the citric acid cycle are major intersections between catabolic and anabolic pathways. Catabolic is the breaking down of molecules, releasing energy, and anabolic is using energy to build molecules up, perhaps more complex molecules from simpler molecules. I mentioned this previously, but I want to hit it again, that we kind of used glucose as our model, but I don't want you to think that glucose or carbohydrates are the only source that can be used in this whole cellular respiration process. That's not true at all. Fats can be used. Fats are digested into glycerol, which is used in glycolysis, and fatty acids can be used in the generation of acetyl coenzyme A. Fatty acids are also broken down by a different process called beta oxidation to create acetyl coenzyme A. As a matter of fact, fats are a very high energy source. One oxidized gram of fat has twice as much potential ATP as an oxidized gram of carbohydrates. So fats are a good source of energy for the body, and even though that doesn't get you glucose directly, there are parts of those fats and lipids that can be used in this entire respiration process. So because they're such high energy molecules, that is a good thing if you're trying to survive. But if you're like most Americans and you tend to have perhaps a little too much of a good thing, well, that also makes it difficult to lose weight, because one oxidized gram of fat is twice as much energy as carbohydrates. So if you're trying to lose fat, you're going to have to exercise even harder. You're going to have to put out even more energy. You're going to have to expend more calories to try to get rid of that excess high energy fat molecules. So take a look at this chart. It kind of shows you some of the pathways that the different materials can follow. So let's say you're eating a hamburger for dinner, and you've got meat and bun and lettuce and tomato and all those good things on there, and some French fries. So the proteins from the meat themselves can be broken down into amino acids. Those amino acids can go into the whole glycolysis process, or creating acetyl coenzyme A, or they can go into the citric acid process, the citric acid cycle. They do produce, or some of the materials are given off as NH3, ammonia, and urea. The carbohydrates, of course, produce sugars. Some of those can be glucose. That goes directly into glycolysis. The fats can be broken down into glycerol, which can go into glycolysis, or fatty acids can go into creating that acetyl coenzyme A, and all of that can end up through your oxidative phosphorylation and creating ATP. So these are all your various catabolic pathways that different molecules can follow. The next slide talks about the building up the anabolic pathways, the biosynthesis. And of course, we already know this, that the body uses smaller molecules to create larger, more complex molecules. So some of these small molecules come directly from the food that we eat. Some of them come from glycolysis and from the citric acid cycle. And some of these products that are created in cellular respiration, not all of these products are used to create ATP. Some of them are kind of used to be building blocks for other materials. So in glycolysis, for the citric acid cycle, you're going to have different products created, and sometimes the cell uses some of those products and says, okay, I'm going to take this out of the whole ATP production cycle, and instead I'm going to use this to build more of whatever it is that it needs to build. How does the body control all of this? Because we got a lot of chemical processes going on. We already mentioned that every chemical reaction requires its energy of activation, and the human body temperature at 98.6 is usually not enough heat energy from the environment to cause these reactions to occur spontaneously. So we have these enzymes that control these various reactions. They control the reactions by lowering that energy of activation. Usually you have a feedback inhibition, which is like a negative feedback loop. So that's the way your body controls this. When the concentration of ATP starts to drop, the respiration process speeds up. When there is plenty of ATP, the body slows down the respiration process. And the control of this breakdown catabolic process is mainly controlled by enzymes, whether you are allowing the enzymes to work as fast as they can or whether you are inhibiting the enzymes in some way. Remember, there were different ways that you can slow down or stop the enzymes from doing their job. Remember, we talked about things like allosteric control and things like that, where you have a particular molecule that will attach to the enzyme protein and change its shape and make it so that it doesn't work, or things like that. So the body has different ways of slowing down the enzyme process or allowing the enzyme process to go as fast as it can. Here's a good example of how cellular respiration is controlled. We have glucose coming into the body, and there is a particular enzyme right here called phosphofructokinase. Man, these words, they are hard to say. Phosphofructokinase. This particular enzyme is kind of a point of control. So when the body is low on ATP, there's going to be a lot of AMP, which is adenine monophosphate. When there's a high amount of AMP, that is a positive stimulator for this enzyme, and it tells this enzyme or allows this enzyme to go forward and speed up the whole process. So as it goes through the whole process, creating pyruvate, acetyl coenzyme A, citric acid cycle, all the way down to oxidative phosphorylation, there's a couple of things that are created. We have ATP that are created at this point. When the ATP builds up, that actually starts to inhibit this enzyme, causes it to slow down its process. And then here we have another molecule, citrate, from the citric acid cycle, that also will slow down this particular enzyme and cause it to slow down. So the body has a way of recognizing, okay, we've got enough ATP, or we're going through this process so much that we're creating so much citrate, and that will then slow down the process from this point. It's an allosteric enzyme, this one right here is. So these products will affect its shape and change the way it's able to do its job. All right, gang, you've done a great job. Let's wrap it up. The energy that we're talking about, the energy that keeps us alive, the energy that allows our heart to beat and our lungs to breathe in and out, and for us to take notes and go to school and go to work and do everything that we want to do, for Miley Cyrus to twerk, that energy is released, not produced by cellular respiration. We are tapping the energy that was stored in food via photosynthesis. And that's actually the next chapter, where we're going to talk about how plants use photosynthesis to capture the sunlight energy and then convert that to chemical energy that is then stored within the body of the plant. And then all other animals either eat plants or eat animals who eat plants. And truly, I mean, that means plants are just way cooler than you and me. I mean, we can't go outside at lunchtime and stand out in the sun and be filled. We have to find food and eat food. Plants can create their own food within their own bodies. I want to make sure you understand that plants do cellular respiration. So some students get confused and they think plants do photosynthesis and animals do respiration. Well, that is true, but plants also do respiration. Plant cells go through that whole aerobic respiration process that we just talked about. So plants just have something extra that they can do called photosynthesis that we cannot. To me, because I'm a science geek, it's pretty amazing. My family likes to go camping, so anytime we go camping, we like to build a nice campfire and sit out there late at night around the flames and the embers. And when you think about it from a scientific standpoint, it's amazing, because the tree that we're burning, the wood that we're burning, is made out of cellulose. Cellulose is a starch, a carbohydrate material, and that material has energy in it. That energy is contained in the cellulose because the plant did photosynthesis, captured energy from the sun, placed it in a chemical form inside that cellulose. And now we're taking that cellulose and we're putting it in the presence of oxygen. It doesn't burst into flame all by itself because of the energy of activation that's necessary to get the process started. So if I add enough heat, enough energy just to kick that process off, then it becomes spontaneous. Once I get my fire to start, as long as conditions are right, the process will continue until all the fuel is gone. So that fire that I'm sitting there staring at is releasing energy. It's going through a chemical process. It's a redox reaction where the cellulose is losing electrons to oxygen. And as those electrons are dropping down the energy level, all that free energy is released as light and heat. And it's almost like the energy from the sun is reappearing in front of my eyes. So to me, because I'm a geek, I find something as simple as a campfire pretty darn amazing. And if you don't, if your mind can't get blown by thinking about all the chemical and biological processes that are going on just in a campfire, well then I don't know what to say. Your mind just can't be blown. All right, let's wrap it up, ladies and gentlemen. Be sure to go take a look at the crash course video for ATP and cellular respiration. I think these crash course videos help out a lot. They help me, as a matter of fact. I like to view them first and then come back and take a look at the notes. There's a link right there. And just by the way, I want you to know in this crash course video, he's wearing a shirt at the very beginning that shows like a robot and a scientist, and it says science. The red shirt he wears at the gym. I have that exact same shirt at the house. As a matter of fact, I've had that shirt for a long time. I buy it from an online retailer that sells all sorts of geeky science shirts. And apparently Hank and I shop at the same spot. So have fun. Take this in small bites. Ask questions. Go online and go to the discussion forum that we have running to get ready for our next big test. We're on to photosynthesis. See you guys there. Bye-bye.